Pack your things, Oksana, and by tomorrow I don't want a trace of you here. Taras hurled an old travel bag onto the floor with a dull thud. A child's rubber ball fell out and rolled under the wardrobe. I'm done putting up with this provincial boredom. I have a different life now. Find yourself another benefactor to feed you. Helena froze in the narrow hallway, still unable to close the zipper on her right boot. Through the half-open living room door, the elderly woman could see her son's tense back and her daughter-in-law's bewildered face. Little Marco sat on the rug, blinking his big dark eyes in fright, completely unable to understand why his father was shouting so loudly. It had always been said that the marriage between a promising engineer and a plain shop assistant from a small town near Ternopil was a huge mistake. For years, his mother had silently criticized her child's choice. The girl seemed too simple. She couldn't hold a polished social conversation, wore cheap knitted sweaters, and instead of fashionable calves preferred making vareniki in the cramped kitchen. The pensioner would often sigh while looking at Tara's perfectly pressed shirts and believe that her son deserved a better match. And yet what she was seeing now shattered all her old convictions and forced her to look at the situation from a completely different angle. Taras, what is going on? The older woman asked, stepping into the room and leaning on the doorframe, trying to steady the tremor in her voice. The man turned sharply, hiding his irritation for a moment, but immediately put back on a mask of cold composure. Mom, you're late. Oksana and I are getting divorced. I've met someone on my level, Yulia. She's an architect. We understand each other perfectly. He nodded dismissively toward his wife, who stood silently swallowing tears and clutching a child's pajamas to her chest. This place is a swamp. This apartment belongs to me, it came from my father. So let her gather her rags and go to her mother's village. Nobody is keeping anyone here. My mother has a 2-room house and a bedridden grandfather, Oksana said quietly, lowering her head so far that strands of hair covered her tear-stained cheeks. Where am I supposed to go with a child in winter? That's not my problem, Taras barked, walking to the window and jerking the curtain with nervous impatience. You should have thought earlier, when you were sitting on maternity leave and didn't want to develop yourself. I'm tired of coming home and hearing about diaper prices and porridge. Helena felt a heavy, bitter knot rise in her chest. Then the fog seemed to lift from her eyes. She looked at her successful, well-groomed son and saw before her a completely cruel man, a selfish creature she herself had raised, dusting off his path, giving away her last savings for tutors and university contracts, and then she turned her gaze to Oksana, the ordinary, kind mother of her grandson, who had never once spoken an unkind word to that demanding relative, though she had felt the constant contempt very well. You are not going anywhere, Helena Vasilievna said firmly, stepping over the threshold into the living room and placing herself between her son and daughter-in-law. The engineer raised his eyebrows in surprise, clearly expecting his mother, as always, to take his side and help throw the unwanted guests out the door. Mom, don't start. I've already decided everything and bought the tickets to Turkey. Yulia is moving in on Friday. We need to prepare the place for the new renovation. I said Oksana and Marco are staying here, the elderly woman replied. Her voice turned metallic, the same tone she had once used when reprimanding careless postal workers during the 30 years she had worked at the post office. And if you're so in love, pack your laptop and go live with your architect. Tomorrow we'll sort out who moves where. You're seriously defending her? The man choked, meeting his mother's hard, icy stare. Shut your mouth and get out of the apartment at once. Taras stood frozen for a few seconds, breathing deeply through his nose, trying to swallow the unexpected resistance. Then he abruptly grabbed his car keys from the table, snatched up his leather jacket, and headed for the door. Fine. Stay here tonight, he threw over his shoulder. But tomorrow evening I'm coming back with a locksmith and changing the locks. Don't you dare try to take anything from the appliances. The apartment door slammed with such force that the window panes rattled in the old brick building. Heavy silence settled over the apartment, broken only by Oksana's quiet sobbing and little Marco's anxious sniffling. Terrified by the noise, the child hid behind the arm of the sofa, clutching his rubber ball tightly in his fist. Helena slowly took off her coat, hung it carefully on the hook, and returned to the living room. "Go wash your face with cold water," the mother-in-law said softly, looking at the bewildered figure of her daughter-in-law. "I'll make tea and calm the child for now. Tears won't change anything." The girl nodded obediently and dragged herself toward the bathroom, barely lifting her feet. The older woman sat down beside her grandson, extended her wrinkled hand, and gently stroked the boy's fair hair. "It's all right, little bird. Daddy just went to work the night shift. Come out now. We'll have tea with oatmeal cookies." The kitchen greeted them with the cold light of a fluorescent lamp. Outside, evening turnippled softly. Along Succa Avenue cars rushed past, splashing deep puddles. Damp wind drove wet November leaves across the sidewalks. Helena took 2 ceramic cups from the cabinet and dropped a bag of herbal tea into each. The boiling water and the kettle's steam filled the small room with the warm, soothing scent of chamomile and mint. Oksana sat on a stool, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to keep warm. Her eyes were red and swollen. Dark hair had come loose into unruly strands that fell over her pale face. "Mrs. Helena, what happens now?" The daughter-in-law's voice trembled. "I really have nowhere to go. There's no work in the village. My father is sick. Expensive medicine takes all of my mother's tiny pension. And here the kindergarten is close. I was only just starting to look for cashier jobs in a supermarket." The mother-in-law placed a hot cup in front of her, sat opposite, and sighed heavily, resting her elbows on the table. "Drink. And don't dare hide your eyes. You are guilty of nothing." The young mother obediently took a sip, burning her trembling lips. "I know you never loved me," Oksana burst out suddenly, lifting her gaze and looking straight at Helena. "I know you thought I was beneath a clever man like your son. But I truly loved this family. I cared for everyone, washed, cooked a hot meal every evening. And it turned out he didn't want a family at all, only a convenient free servant while he looked for something better." The words struck the pensioner like an invisible whip, because they were the pure truth, harsh, uncomfortable truth, one the older woman had stubbornly refused to admit for all 3 years of their marriage. "Forgive me, child," Helena said quietly, but with striking clarity. "I was blind and foolish. Blinded by pride in my own son's achievements. I thought success was measured by positions, expensive suits, and pretty words. But it turned out Taras grew into an ordinary scoundrel, capable of throwing his own blood out into the frost." Oksana blinked in surprise, her eyelashes wet with tears. For the first time in all their long acquaintance, her mother-in-law had called her a child and sincerely asked for forgiveness. The wall of estrangement that had stood between them for years suddenly cracked deep and wide. "We won't be lost," Helena Vasilievna continued, firmly taking her daughter-in-law's cold hand. "I have a little savings set aside for a rainy day. Seems that day has come. Tomorrow morning we'll start looking for new housing, and let him keep this apartment and choke on it together with his architect. We are not going to endure humiliation or beg for charity." The morning turned out to be especially gray and damp. Ternopil lay far below, covered in the dull shimmer of tiny waves. The sharp northern wind cut straight to the bone. The women woke early, barely after sunrise. Taras did not call, only sent a short text message. By 6 p.m. The apartment had to be completely emptied, otherwise he would call the police and change the locks himself. Helena, reading the message on the cracked screen of her old smartphone, only twisted her lips into a bitter smile. "So, that's the kind of bastard you are," she whispered, immediately deleting the message so Oksana wouldn't accidentally see that outright nastiness. After a quick breakfast of plain oatmeal, Marco's mother began silently packing their things into a large plaid bag. Toys, the child's winter clothes, a few simple dresses of her own, the old laptop used for cartoons, 2 warm blankets. Their modest life fit easily into 4 bulky packages, which were soon lined up by the front door. Meanwhile, the pensioner sat at the kitchen table with a battered notebook and a ballpoint pen, carefully studying fresh ads in the local newspaper and browsing websites on her phone. Rent in the city had risen sharply over the past year. Apartments in the center or in the prestigious Druzhba district cost absurd sums the two women simply did not have. A few calls brought only disappointment. Realtors demanded huge commissions, and landlords flatly refused to accept tenants with small children, fearing damaged wallpaper and scribbled walls. I found one rather decent option in the Skidney district, Helena finally said, tiredly adjusting her glasses. One spacious room, no modern renovation, but the price is reasonable, and the owner doesn't mind a child. We'll go look at it right now. As for Marco, we'll leave him with the neighbor, Aunt Nadia. The pensioner has long wanted a little one to fuss over, so she'll be happy to keep him for a couple of hours. The trip in the crowded yellow minibus took almost 40 minutes. At the stop near the old airplane, the women got out, pulling their jackets tight and turning their faces toward the fine, biting autumn rain. The brick building they needed turned out to be a typical 5-story Khrushchev-era block, with peeling gray walls in the stairwell and the smell of fried onions on the stairs. The owner, an extremely bulky woman named Vera, met the prospective tenants by the metal door and looked them over from head to toe with obvious suspicion. "Right, girls, here's how it is," the landlady began at once, rattling her keys loudly. "Use water sparingly, don't flood the neighbors downstairs, and no noisy parties. Payment is 2 months in advance, in cash. We won't be signing any contract, no taxes, you understand." The room smelled distinctly of old wood, dust, and mothballs. On the floor lay a faded Soviet burgundy carpet. By the cold wall stood a massive sofa with worn brown upholstery, and beside it loomed a bulky lacquered wall cabinet. Yet everything was relatively clean. The wallpaper held together, and on the wide windowsill violets bloomed cheerfully in plastic pots. Oksana slowly surveyed the extremely modest, poor little home and smiled, barely noticeably, but sincerely. There were no expensive furnishings here, no terrors, but there were also no constant reproaches. "It suits us perfectly," the girl said firmly, taking from her thin wallet the last money she had earned before maternity leave. Helena added her own share from the savings of her pension, counted the small bills several times, and carefully handed them to the landlady. The heavy keys landed on the wooden table with a dull metallic ring. It was the clear sound of a beginning, a very difficult beginning, but a completely independent life. The next morning, the question of steady work became urgent. Their saved money would last at most 1 month, enough for very modest food and utilities. The kindergarten fees for little Marco were partially covered by state benefits, but for a truly decent life, that was far too little. "You used to sew very well," Helena suddenly remembered, watching as her daughter-in-law skillfully and quickly darned the child's woolen tights by the window. "I remember you even made your own evening dress for your first wedding anniversary." "It was a long time ago," the girl said sadly, biting through a thread. "I took sewing courses at school and at home my mother's old machine was still standing there. But that was ages ago. Who would hire me now at a proper workplace without a relevant diploma and no work record? Don't be foolish and don't belittle yourself. Your hands remember everything. There's a big sewing workshop on Tekstilna Street. They always need workers on the production line. My old acquaintance used to work there as chief technologist before retirement. I'll call her now and find out about vacancies." After a short but emotional conversation on the old phone, the interview was set for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The garment factory greeted Oksana with the thunderous roar of dozens of mechanical machines, the thick smell of a hot iron, warmed fabric, and the distinctive scent of machine oil. The vast factory floor was brightly flooded with the cold light of powerful lamps. Dozens of women in blue uniforms bent low over wide tables, expertly and rapidly guiding multicolored fabric beneath sharp needles. The supervisor, an extremely stern woman with a boyish short haircut and glasses on a cord, gave the trembling applicant a thoroughly critical look. "No production experience. Very bad, but we always need staff. Girls quit all the time. Sit at the empty machine there by the window. I'll give you a simple test task. You need to stitch these 10 winter jacket pieces with a perfectly straight seam. If you do it well and quickly, we'll take you on probation at minimum wage. The young mother's heart pounded so hard it seemed the echo of the beats was spreading through the entire noisy workshop. She carefully sat on the hard chair and ran her cold hand over the smooth metal surface of the powerful industrial sewing machine. This was far from a small old Singer machine at home with a comfortable pedal. The giant electric apparatus looked terribly complicated and frankly frightening. The girl carefully placed a dark piece of thick fabric under the presser foot, lowered the metal lever, and uncertainly pressed the wide pedal with her foot. The machine suddenly lurched forward with a loud crack. The thin thread snapped instantly with a sharp sound, and the expensive fabric was hopelessly crumpled into a tight accordion. Oksana jerked her hands back in fright, feeling hot, burning tears of complete helplessness rushed to her eyes. It was all over. They would throw her out in disgrace, and there would be no way to pay for the apartment. Don't hurry, and don't panic. The calm, deep male voice sounded suddenly very close. The young woman sharply raised her head and saw before her a tall man of about 40. He wore ordinary worn jeans and a faded plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. There was early silvering at the temples, and small kind wrinkles hid in the corners of his warm brown eyes. In his strong, sinewy hands, the worker held a long screwdriver and a small wrench. My name is Nazar. I'm the local mechanic and technician, he introduced himself simply, leaning over the blocked machine. You started too abruptly and pressed too hard. This model is very sensitive to pedal pressure. Also, the upper thread tension got a bit off after the previous seamstress, which is why it keeps snapping. His large hands, marked with tiny scars and calluses, expertly opened the side panel with a screwdriver, carefully pulled out the tangled knot of thread, and swiftly inserted a new spool. Every movement was precise, measured, and completely confident. Oksana suddenly felt calmer just from the presence of this completely unfamiliar man. To her great surprise, unlike her former husband, who used to rage over the smallest domestic mistake, this worker radiated endless patience and tangible support. Try again. Nazar stepped back one pace, giving her room. Just breathe evenly. Don't hold your breath. And press the lower pedal as smoothly as if you were gently stroking a small kitten. The girl inhaled deeply, breathing in dust and machine air, and took a fresh practice piece of fabric. This time her foot pressed the metal as softly as possible. The powerful machine purred quietly and evenly, leaving behind a perfect, straight, beautiful white seam on the dark fabric. The mechanic nodded warmly in approval, putting his tools back into the pocket of his work apron. You have surprisingly light hands. The main thing in our line of work is never to be afraid of the machine. It can sense fear. If it ever jams again or starts knocking, call me right away. My workstation is at the far end of the corridor on the right. Nazar turned and walked calmly, unhurriedly, between the long rows of tables, while Oksana stood for a few more minutes, watching him go and feeling a smoky, long-forgotten warmth rising in her solar plexus. Thanks to that brief help, the test task was completed perfectly. The stern supervisor, after carefully checking every seam under the bright lamp, dryly and without emotion told her to come for a full first shift at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. That evening, returning to the cold rented apartment on the outskirts, the young mother was met by incredibly cozy smells of potatoes fried in oil and fresh dill. Helena was busily tending the old creaking gas stove, wearing a flowered house apron she had found in the cupboard. Marco sat at the round kitchen table, quietly and delightedly drawing with colored pencils in his new album. Well, how did things go at the factory? The mother-in-law asked hopefully, carefully drying her wet hands with a waffle towel. They took me into the workshop. At last, a broad, absolutely sincere smile of relief appeared on the tired face of her daughter-in-law. I'll be sewing warm winter jackets. The starting wage is fairly small, but they promise stable payment twice a month without delays. Well then, excellent. Simply excellent. That means we'll definitely survive. Sit down quickly and have dinner, worker, before the potatoes get cold. They ate as a family of 3, discussing tomorrow's immediate plans. Where could they buy cheaper groceries at the market? Where could they find discounted diapers for the little one in pharmacies? How could they insulate the old wooden windows with foam, since the draft was clearly coming through the cracks? Suddenly the girl's old smartphone vibrated sharply on the oilcloth table, breaking the idyll. On the cracked screen, Tara's name lit up brightly. Oksana jerked as if struck by electricity. The fork froze halfway to her mouth. Helena Vasilievna, without saying a word, calmly extended her wrinkled hand, took the phone, and decisively pressed.